Hey yo, it's JAMR. I'm making this the second video as part of a series of two about GDP, the importance, what it is, what it does, and everything you should know about it. But I realized that I skipped going over the piecemeal definition in the last video, so I'm going to share my screen to the book and go over this little picture that the book has that I think is really helpful. If I can click on the right thing. This little picture, the GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a year. So the market value, it's just value each product at its market price. Self-explanatory what it's going to cost in the market. Of all, include all goods and services. So you're going to include all the final goods. So you're going to include like this cup, or you're going to include the service provided by MLB players for playing in a game that you guys go to. So a service like that, a final service to you, or say the military, the soldiers being paid by the government, that's a final service. I'll get into something like that later. That's more under government spending. Think more of people coming to clean or like clean your house, or the exterminators, something like that. Final goods and service. Final goods and services, count only final goods and services, omitting immediate ones. So like I said, the final good, the finished products that you buy, the consumer from the store, or from the final service provided by somebody that you hire. It's not going to count anything that makes it up. So you're going to leave out like the component costs, like the microchip in, say, like an iPod, along with the glass and the plastic thereof. You're only going to count the final sale. So say that what is like an old iPhone 5. You're going to only count like the $300 that it costs you when you buy it. But produced, so I'm at the resale of already purchased goods. If you want to sell like your iPod to a friend of yours, you're not going to include that because it's not the final good. It's a used good. The final good is gone. You took that label away from it when you purchased it from the store. Within a country, include all goods produced within the United States, even by foreign-owned businesses, but exclude goods produced overseas, even by American-owned companies and businesses. So include the goods produced in the United States. So all the goods produced in the United States, all the services provided in the United States, including those. So like by a Nissan dealership, if a Nissan dealership is selling cars in the United States, you'd include in the GDP like the sales stuff that they gave from that dealership, even if they're a foreign-owned company. But likewise, you're also not going to include the sales by like a Harley Davidson dealership or manufacturer in Germany because it's in Germany. It's physically in Germany. You're going to include the Nissan's outputs because they're physically in the United States. In a year, add up the flow of output over a year. Just a time frame, which you added up. A year. It's good enough. If that was redundant to some of you, I apologize, but I figured I'd include it just because maybe some of you were a little shaky. But I will go to the slideshow. So calculating GDP by expenditures. So GDP is the consumption in a population or in a country plus the government spending of a country plus the investment in a country plus the net exports of a country. So where consumption is C, well, it's self-explanatory. I don't need to go through that. But consumption is going to be things like you purchasing something from the store. That couch in the book is a great example. The $1,500 you spend on that. The government spending is going to be akin to something like the wages they give to their soldiers for keeping us safe at night. Investment is going to be something like money purchased or money used to purchase and build a factory, because it's an investment for future productivity, something like that, or like infrastructure is a good example as well. Net exports is a little more complicated in the United States. I'll get into that more in depth later, so I'll omit that for now. But consumption, like I said, the final goods bought and sold in the economy, that couch, the $1,500 you spent on that couch in the store, brand new. You remove the label of final good or service from something the minute that you buy it. So it's goods that aren't used to make other goods. Like I said, you completely take out like the component cost from, say, that iPod. And it's the easiest way to compare different goods. It's using prices. You're going to compare the market price because the final goods and services are present in the market, and makes sense too, right? Because you're going to the store, you're going to compare. You're looking for a specific product. You're going to compare the prices of these two that you're thinking of if you narrow it down, and pick whatever's cheaper. It's just inherently something that we do. We compare price. Government spending, when the government buys goods or pays salaries, But not when the government pays benefits like Social Security, unemployment, those are transfer payments. So, like I said, the government's spending is going to be things like wages for soldiers, for government's employees, like working at the CIA or the Pentagon or the Department of Agriculture or Homeland Security or something like that. That's all going to be government spending, or even like on a more local scale. If you live in a town where it's a public school, they receive a lot of federal funding or town funding or state funding, then the state is directly paying their salary essentially. And so it's a good example. The teachers there are being paid by the local government. But the transfer payments provide the reason why Social Security and benefits aren't included is because you're not giving it to somebody new as a final product. It's just you're moving money from one place to another, if that makes sense. You're moving. So for with Social Security, it's just the money is there. It's just moving into a different place. It's not moving to you, it's moving to your account. The government is just shifting money into a different place. It's still technically the government's money, but they're just moving it to a different spot. So that's why we don't include it, because it's quite literally a transfer of money, transfer payment. Investment are goods that are used later. Like I said, it's funny, it's the only thing on the screen. It's a lot of white space. Are goods or services that are used later. You spend money on buying land and building up a factory that will produce goods later on is an investment. You're investing in the potential goods, and it will be used later. The factory will be used later for that. The road system in the United States, the interstate, that's an investment. It was a good that was used later. A storage sheds are another one. But really, factory. Go to the factory. Factory is the best example there because it'll be used later. And it's a good that will be used later. A good / service that will be used later. Okay, net exports. Net exports is a little weird in the United States. It's simple, but it's weird. So it's what manufacturers in a country send or sell to people or firms in other countries. Net minus all the things produced in other countries and sent here. So that means purchased by our country. And what about exports and imports? The GDP counts for those. And that means that what we're going to do with the United States, because we're an import economy, we always are going to spend, well, not always. We're spending more currently than we are selling to other countries. So we're importing more than we're exporting. We're going to subtract the amount of money that we spend on imports from the total amount of money that we make on exports. So that means that it's usually going to be negative. It's always going to be a negative value that we're going to subtract from in that equation in order to get GDP. And what about saving? People have a tendency to save money. A good example is when times are tough. People figure that it's better to hold on to every cent that they can get, which is not beneficial. Ironically, it's better for you in the short term, but worse for the economy in the long term, because it's just going to make whatever depression is present last longer and longer and longer. So if you save money that's not circulating in the economy, it's not being included in GDP, but will eventually. Savings are eventually spent. People eventually spend that money. But say the stimulus checks that have been going out, people are given those with the sincere hope that they spend it because it is meant to stimulate the economy. Because if it circulates back into it, that's money that essentially the government puts into itself through the people, which is good. It's not a bad thing. They give it to people who then use it themselves. So they use it on themselves in the market, and then that circulates back into the overall economy and it's like helps the GDP immensely. So that's a good example of that. But savings, the bottom line is that savings are eventually spent. That was just a little aside to talk about instances where people save and how and when they spend. But what about household production? Agencies that calculate GDP try, but may not fully capture this. So if it's just something small in the household, like a kid who wants to make a lemonade stand, it's really difficult for GDP to calculate this. We usually only go after the final goods and services. And even though that is a final good and service, it's just on such a small scale that it's usually going to slip through the net. But it should be included. Like, absolutely. Don't think that it shouldn't just because it's on such a small scale. What about illegal under the counter activity? It does not, GDP doesn't include that because it is illegal under the counter. The government literally cannot see it if it's under the counter or illegal. We call this like a black market is a fantastic example. We're not going to be able to count that because it's just literally invisible. So in reality, the GDP is actually probably higher, a little bit higher than it currently is calculated as being, because we don't include the illegal activity or the household production, but probably not significantly. But those are two things that slip through the net most of the time. But that's it. That's how you calculate GDP. That's all she wrote. The important equation. Remember this. Just important. The important sum of consumption is the purchase of final goods. Is the final goods bought and sold in the economy. Government spending is just the money the government itself spends on goods and services, so the soldiers and the federal employees, but not things like Social Security. Those are transfer payments whenever the government just moves money from one place to another, as opposed to buying something or selling something itself. Not selling something itself, just when the government buys something or pays the salary, then it's not going to be included. It's just a movement of money. Investment of goods that are used later, the purchase of goods that are used later, so the purchase of land and the money that goes into building the factory is going to be an investment, because you're literally investing in something that will be used later, or service that will be used later. And the net exports, you're just going to add up the amount of, you're going to subtract the amount of money that you spend on exporting, or that you spend on importing on good. You're going to subtract the amount of money that you use to buy imports from the amount of money that you make on selling exports. And the cumulative total in the entire economy is going to be GDP. So with that, stop sharing. If you guys have any questions, if I went through too quickly and just want me to go back over something and talk to me about stuff, let me know in Slack or email. But that is essentially what GDP is, how it's calculated. Is very important because it's a good measure of how the economy is doing and how people are doing when you break it down into GDP per capita. But that's a little more complex and in depth, and will be covered in later videos. But like I said, if you guys have any questions, let me know. And I hope you enjoyed.